November 30, 1853. Dawn breaks over the Black Sea port of Sinope, but the light brings no warmth, only the cold clarity of impending doom. Within the harbor, the Ottoman fleet sits in a deceptive calm. 7 frigates, the wooden walls of the Sultan's power, are anchored in a tight crescent. On deck, the morning routine is rhythmic and unsuspecting. Sailors are huddling over bowls of hot soup, their breath mingling with the damp salt air. You can hear the low murmur of conversation and the distant cry of a gull. It is a scene of domesticity in a theater of war, but on the horizon, the mist is beginning to tear. 6 massive Russian ships of the line, commanded by Vice Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, emerge like ghosts from the grey veil of the sea. These are not merely ships, they are floating fortresses of oak, their gun ports yawning like the mouths of hungry predators. The Ottoman sailors scramble, breakfast is kicked aside, and boots thud against the decks. But they are already dead. They just don't know it yet. They are about to face a nightmare that will change the face of naval warfare forever. How does it feel to watch the world you know vanish in a heartbeat? For those sailors, the answer wasn't a bullet, it was a miracle of destruction. The Russians aren't firing solid iron balls today. They are using Pakistan's guns. In 1853, this was the equivalent of bringing a futuristic weapon to a medieval sword fight. When a solid shot hits wood, it punches a hole. When a shell from a Pakistan's gun hits wood, it detonates. The first Ottoman frigate doesn't just take a hit, it vanishes. One moment, men are standing at their stations, the next, the ship is a volcano of splinters and screaming. The shells lodge deep in the hull and explode from the inside out, turning the very timber meant to protect the sailors into thousands of jagged, high-speed daggers. Think about that for a second. Have you ever stood your ground, confident in your tools, only to realize the person across from you is playing by a set of rules you didn't even know existed? That is the terror of the untold history we explore here. These men weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting a future they weren't prepared to see. The water in the harbor begins to burn. Oil, gunpowder, and tar-soaked wood create a slick of fire on the surface of the Black Sea. Sailors who dive overboard to escape the inferno on deck find themselves swimming through a liquid hell. For 6 hours, the Russian guns do not stop. It is systematic. It is cold. It is an annihilation. Nakhimov's squadron isn't just winning a battle, they are deleting an entire fleet from existence. By the afternoon, the harbor of Sinope is a graveyard. 3,000 Ottoman sailors are dead. Only one ship escapes to tell the tale. The Russian casualty count? 37. But here is the question that should keep you up: how did this single afternoon, this localized massacre in a remote corner of the Black Sea, force the 2 greatest rivals on earth, Britain and France, to join forces in an alliance that should have been impossible? Why would the British, who spent centuries trying to humble the French, suddenly march side by side with them into the Russian meat grinder? The answer isn't in the water of Sinope. It's in the palaces of London and the ego of a man in Paris who was desperate to prove he was worthy of his uncle's name. Before we move into those halls of power where the real game was being played, I want to ask you something. When you hear about a massacre like Sinope, do you see it as a necessary evil of war, or a calculated atrocity meant to send a message? Dark History Untold is a channel built on these questions. We don't just give you dates, we give you the weight of the blood spilled. If you believe that history should be a lesson, not just a lecture, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that there are still people who want to understand the why behind the what. If you're new, subscribe. Because we are about to pull back the curtain on a war where 500,000 men paid the price for a fight over a set of church keys. The news of Sinope didn't just travel, it erupted. In 1853, the telegraph was beginning to shrink the world, and for the first time, the public felt the heat of the fire while the ashes were still warm. When the reports reached London and Paris, they weren't presented as a naval victory. The Western press, hungry for a villain, painted a terrifying image of a Russian giant crushing a helpless victim. They called it a massacre of almost unparalleled barbarity. But the giant was Tsar Nicholas I, and he was genuinely confused. In his mind, he had done exactly what a Tsar should do: protect the interests of his faith and his empire. He didn't understand that he had just lit a fuse that would lead directly to the gates of Sevastopol. He thought he was playing a regional game. He didn't realize he had just started the first truly global industrial conflict. The massacre at Sinope wasn't an isolated event. It was the consequence of a spark struck 2 years earlier in the dust of Jerusalem. A spark that started not with cannons, but with monks throwing punches in a church. Imagine the holiest site in Christendom turned into a tavern brawl. That is where our story truly begins, with a fight over who gets to hold the keys to a door, and how that petty squabble set the world on fire. To understand why thousands of men were eventually sent to die in the frozen trenches of Crimea, we have to travel back to 1852, to the dusty, sun-drenched streets of Bethlehem. It is one of the strangest ironies in history that a war defined by industrial slaughter began in the quiet, sacred dimness of the Church of the Nativity. Imagine the scene. This is the place where tradition says Jesus was born. It is a site of ultimate peace, yet inside, the atmosphere is thick with a very earthly hatred. For centuries, different Christian denominations had lived in a state of simmering resentment, forced to share the same holy rafters under the watchful, often amused eye of their Ottoman masters. But in 1852, that resentment boiled over into a literal riot. Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox monks, men who had dedicated their lives to the gospel of peace, began beating each other bloody. They weren't debating fine points of theology or arguing over the nature of the divine. They were throwing punches over who had the right to repair a leaky roof. They were wrestling on the stone floors over who could place a silver star in the grotto of the Nativity. They were swinging candlesticks and heavy crosses at each other's heads because of a set of keys. Specifically, the keys to the great front doors of the church. To a casual observer, it was a petty, embarrassing squabble between elderly men in robes. But in the high-stakes world of 19th-century geopolitics, those keys were a proxy for something much larger. They were a symbol of influence, and whoever held the keys to the church held the ear of the Ottoman Sultan. This brings us to our first major player, Napoleon III. Now, you have to understand that Napoleon III was a man living in a very large shadow. He was the nephew of the great Napoleon, but he lacked the military genius and the inherent legitimacy of his uncle. He had seized power in a coup d'état just a year earlier, and he knew his throne was built on sand. He needed the support of the French Catholic Church to stay in power, and he knew that nothing stirred French national pride quite like a crusade. Napoleon looked at the brawling monks in Bethlehem and saw a golden opportunity. He didn't care about the silver star or the leaky roof, but he cared deeply about looking like the champion of Catholicism. He sent an ultimatum to the Sultan in Constantinople: grant the Roman Catholics the keys to the church and the right to the holy sites, or face the might of the French Mediterranean fleet. It was a classic move of a man who felt small and needed to look big. By forcing the Sultan to back his monks over the Orthodox ones, Napoleon wasn't just winning a religious argument, he was telling the world that France was once again the dominant power in the East. He was asserting Mediterranean supremacy through the barrel of a naval gun, using a church door as his excuse. However, if Napoleon III had an ego, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia had a divine complex. Nicholas was the gendarme of Europe, a man who believed he was the divinely appointed protector of all Orthodox Christians, numbering some 12 million souls living under Ottoman rule. To Nicholas, the Sultan's sudden pivot toward France wasn't just a diplomatic slight, it was a religious betrayal and a personal insult. Nicholas was a man of rigid discipline and terrifying certainty. He looked at the Ottoman Empire and didn't see a sovereign state, he saw the sick man of Europe, a crumbling ruin that was destined to be carved up by the great powers. In his mind, Constantinople was the rightful inheritance of the Russian soul, the second Rome, that had fallen to the Turks in 1453 and was waiting for a Tsar to reclaim it. When the Sultan, pressured by French warships, handed the keys of the Bethlehem Church to the Catholics, Nicholas felt the foundations of his world tremble. If he allowed the French to bully the Sultan into sidelined Orthodox interests, Russia's influence in the Balkans and the Black Sea would evaporate. This wasn't just about monks anymore. This was about the Bosphorus. This was about the narrow straits that served as the only exit for Russia's southern fleet. For Russia, the Eastern question was an existential one. If the Ottomans collapsed and the French or British moved in, Russia would be bottled up in the Black Sea, its southern flank permanently exposed. Nicholas decided that he could no longer wait for the sick man to die on his own. He would hasten the demise. In early 1853, Nicholas dispatched Prince Alexander Menshikov to Constantinople. Menshikov was chosen not for his diplomatic skill, but for his arrogance. He arrived with a deliberate lack of ceremony, wearing dirty boots to meetings with Ottoman officials and refusing to follow protocol. He wasn't there to negotiate, he was there to deliver a surrender demand disguised as a treaty. Russia demanded a formal protectorate over every Orthodox subject in the Ottoman Empire. If the Sultan agreed, he was essentially handing Nicholas a veto over his own domestic policy. It would turn the Ottoman Empire into a Russian puppet state overnight. The Sultan, caught between the French hammer and the Russian anvil, turned to the British. The British ambassadors, terrified of Russian ships appearing in the Mediterranean and threatening the routes to India, told the Sultan to stand his ground. They promised that if the Tsar's shadow fell too heavily across the Danube, the British lion would roar. So, here we have the absurd spark. A group of monks fighting in a basement in Bethlehem provided the perfect cover for three emperors to test each other's resolve. Napoleon III wanted glory to secure his shaky throne. Nicholas I wanted a religious mandate to cover his imperial expansion. And the British wanted to keep the sick man alive just long enough to ensure no one else got his inheritance. The logic was circular and deadly. Because a monk wanted a specific key, a czar sent an army. Because a czar sent an army, an emperor sent a fleet. And because an emperor sent a fleet, the British public began to scream for blood. This is the hidden tragedy of 1852. The men making these decisions in the gilded palaces of St. Petersburg and Paris thought they were playing a grand game of chess. They thought they could calibrate the tension, push just far enough to get what they wanted without a general war. They viewed the monks as pawns and the Ottoman Empire as the board. But they forgot one thing: once you invoke the fires of religious and national pride, you lose the ability to put them out. Nicholas truly believed that the Western powers would never unite against him. He believed that the ancient hatred between Britain and France was stronger than their fear of Russia. He believed he could walk into the Sultan's house and take what he wanted. By the time the diplomatic cables reached their destinations in the spring of 1853, the absurd spark had become a wildfire. The keys to a church in Bethlehem had unlocked the doors to a century of conflict. Before we move on to how this diplomatic disaster turned into a military invasion, I want you to look at these three leaders: a pretender in France, a zealot in Russia, and a terrified sultan in Turkey. Which one do you think bears the most responsibility for the carnage that followed? Was it Napoleon's vanity, or Nicholas's obsession? Drop a comment below and let's discuss the ego of empires. And if you're finding the untold truth of this war as fascinating as I do, make sure you've liked this video. It helps us keep the lights on here at the channel. The stage was now set. The monks were done fighting. The soldiers were about to begin. Nicholas was preparing to cross the river, certain of his victory, unaware that he was marching toward the greatest humiliation of his life. In the summer of 1853, Tsar Nicholas I stood before a map of Europe, convinced that he was the master of its fate. To the world, Russia was a giant, a massive, impenetrable monolith with an army of over 1 million men. But the giant was walking into a trap of its own making, built not from enemy steel, but from the Tsar's own delusions. Nicholas was not a stupid man, but he was a victim of his own narrative. He believed he had calculated every variable. He had identified 4 truths that made a Russian victory in the East not just likely, but inevitable. These 4 fatal assumptions would become the foundation of a catastrophe. His first assumption was rooted in a sense of misplaced gratitude. Nicholas believed that the Austrian Empire was his to command. Only 4 years earlier, in 1849, the Austrian throne had been on the verge of total collapse, nearly torn apart by Hungarian revolutionaries. Nicholas had sent 200,000 Russian troops across the border to crush that rebellion and save the young Emperor Franz Joseph. He believed that blood debt meant something. He assumed that when Russia moved to carve up the Ottoman Empire, Austria would either stand by him or, at the very least, remain a silent, grateful observer. He forgot the oldest rule in European statecraft: gratitude is a fleeting emotion, but national interest is eternal. To Austria, a Russian-dominated Balkan region was a far greater threat than a dying Ottoman one. His second assumption was that the animosity between Britain and France was permanent. For centuries, London and Paris had been the poles of European conflict. The Napoleonic Wars were still a living memory for the elderly officers in both capitals. Nicholas looked at the map and saw 2 natural enemies who could never sit at the same table, let alone share a trench. He couldn't imagine a world where the British lion and the French eagle would hunt together. This led directly to his third assumption, a total lack of respect for Napoleon III. To Nicholas, the man sitting in the Tuileries palace was a pretender. He was a commoner who had dressed himself in his uncle's old clothes. Nicholas famously refused to address Napoleon as "my brother," a standard courtesy among European monarchs, instead using the frosty "my friend." He believed Napoleon was too weak, too illegitimate, and too inexperienced to ever commit France to a major land war against the Russian colossus. Finally, Nicholas believed he understood the British soul. He viewed the British as a nation of merchants. In his eyes, they were people who cared about spreadsheets and trade routes, not honor or territory. He assumed they would rattle their sabers and shout in Parliament to protect their commerce, but they would never commit their sons to the mud of a distant peninsula for the sake of the sick man of Europe. He believed the British were too pragmatic for a crusade. Every single one of these pillars was made of glass. In May 1853, after the Ottoman Sultan refused the humiliating terms delivered by the arrogant Prince Menshikov, Nicholas decided it was time to move beyond the diplomatic charade. He ordered his armies to cross the Pruth River and occupy the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, territories that are today part of Romania. Nicholas called this a temporary measure. He told the world it was merely a material guarantee to force the Sultan back to the negotiating table. It was the 19th century equivalent of peacekeeping in a neighbor's backyard. He was convinced that by seizing these territories, he would break the Sultan's will before the Western powers could even agree on a response. But the crossing of the Pruth did the one thing Nicholas thought was impossible: it unified his enemies. In London, the merchants were replaced by hawks. The British public, fueled by a press that depicted the Tsar as a brutal tyrant threatening the balance of civilization, demanded action. In Paris, Napoleon III realized that a war against Russia alongside the British was exactly the prestige project he needed to silence his critics and cement his dynasty. And in Vienna, the young Franz Joseph looked at the Russian troops on his border and felt not gratitude, but a cold, existential fear. Nicholas had expected a short, sharp diplomatic victory. Instead, he had triggered a continental fever. As Russian troops marched into the Danubian principalities, they weren't just occupying land, they were stepping into a geopolitical vice. The diplomatic charade was now over, replaced by a terrifying momentum. The British and French fleets were ordered to the Dardanelles. The Ottoman Sultan, emboldened by Western support, formally declared war in October 1853. The giant had stepped across the river, expecting the world to tremble and step back. Instead, the world stepped forward and began to sharpen its bayonets. Nicholas still didn't see the danger. He was blinded by the myth of Russian invincibility. He believed that even if the West did intervene, they could never project enough power so far from their own shores to threaten the heart of Russia. He believed the Black Sea was a Russian lake. Before we see how that lake turned into a slaughterhouse at Sinope, I have to ask you, have you ever seen a leader become so convinced of their own legend that they stop listening to reality? That is the tragedy of Nicholas I. He wasn't just fighting Britain or France, he was fighting his own ego. Drop a comment below. Do you think that Tsar's assumptions were logical for the time, or was he purely delusional? And if you want to see how this hubris led to the burning waters of the Black Sea, make sure you've hit that like button. The crossing of the Pruth was the point of no return. The sick man had found his doctors, and they were arriving with the most advanced weapons the world had ever seen. The Russian giant was about to learn that being big doesn't matter if you are walking into a storm you didn't see coming. The march toward the Black Sea had begun. The ships were sailing. The first modern war was no longer a threat, it was an inevitability. While the emperors and tsars were busy moving divisions on a map, a silent revolution was occurring in the basements of government offices and the backrooms of newspaper stalls. The Crimean War is often called the first modern war, but that isn't just because of the weapons used on the battlefield. It was the first war where the battlefield was brought directly into the living rooms of the common citizen. For the first time in human history, the lag between a soldier's death and the public's knowledge of it was shrinking from months to mere hours. The culprit was the telegraph. Before 1853, war was a distant, hazy concept. News of a battle traveled at the speed of a horse or a sailing ship. By the time the public read about a victory or a defeat, the blood had dried, the dead were buried, and the political landscape had already shifted. War was something that happened over there, a tragedy viewed through a long and forgiving lens. But the telegraph changed the psychological fabric of the conflict. It was an invisible web of copper wire that connected the front lines of the East to the stock exchanges and breakfast tables of London and Paris. Suddenly, the war was live. When the Russian fleet annihilated the Ottomans at Sinope, the news didn't wait for a slow boat. It pulsed through the wires. The speed of the information created a sense of immediate urgency that stripped away the nuance of diplomacy. You couldn't weigh the complexities of the Eastern question when you were reading a dispatch about burning sailors that had been filed just yesterday. The telegraph made the war personal. It made it visceral. And most importantly, it made it impossible for politicians to ignore. This leads us to the man who would become the world's first true celebrity war correspondent, William Howard Russell of the Times. Before Russell, war reporting was usually handled by junior officers who sent sanitized, heroic accounts back to their hometowns. They wrote about glorious charges and noble sacrifices, carefully omitting the smell of gangrene or the sight of a man crying for his mother in the mud. Russell was different. He didn't work for the army, he worked for the truth. Russell didn't sit in the general's tent sipping sherry. He lived among the rank and file. He watched the soldiers shiver in rotted tents and saw the horses starve when the supply lines collapsed. His dispatches were raw, unfiltered, and devastatingly honest. When he wrote about the massacre at Sinope, he didn't use the language of a military strategist. He used the language of a witness. He described the floating coffins and the unparalleled barbarity of the Russian guns. His writing acted as a catalyst. It transformed a complex geopolitical dispute into a moral crusade. This is where we see the great pattern interrupt of 1853. The conflict shifted from a cold calculation of Mediterranean trade routes to a heated battle between civilization and barbarism. The Western public didn't care about the Bosphorus Straits or the nuances of the Treaty of 1841. They cared about stopping the Russian giant, who was slaughtering their allies. In London, the mood was electric. Crowds gathered in the streets, fueled by Russell's reports, demanding that the government stop dithering and start fighting. Lord Aberdeen, the British Prime Minister, was a man of peace who loathed the idea of war. He tried to negotiate, tried to find a diplomatic exit ramp, but the telegraph had robbed him of the time he needed. Every day he waited, another dispatch arrived, another headline screamed from the newsstands, and another wave of public fury crashed against the doors of Parliament. The British and French citizens were now part of the War Council. They were no longer passive observers, they were active participants, driven by a narrative of moral duty. This was the moral crusade, the idea that Britain and France had a divine obligation to protect the weak against the strong, to defend the sick man against the bully. It was a dangerous shift. When a war becomes a crusade, compromise becomes cowardice. You can't negotiate with barbarism. You can only crush it. The telegraph and the press had created a feedback loop. The public demanded action, the politicians, fearing for their jobs, gave it to them, and the correspondents reported on that action, which fueled more public demand. It was a runaway train of nationalistic fervor that Nicholas I, sitting in his silent palace in St. Petersburg, couldn't begin to comprehend. He was a monarch of the old world, where public opinion was something to be suppressed, not managed. He didn't understand that the merchants he despised were now being led by the readers he ignored. By early 1854, the diplomatic cables were being written for the newspapers as much as they were for the foreign ministries. The dark history of this moment is that the war was arguably voted into existence by a public that had been fed a diet of high-speed outrage. Imagine if your news feed today was filled with nothing but raw, unfiltered dispatches from a front line where your national honor was at stake. How long would you want your leaders to wait and see? That was the reality of 1854. Before we move on to the actual invasion, the moment the boots finally hit the sand, I want to ask you, do you think the telegraph was a tool for truth, or was it the original machine for war propaganda? Did William Howard Russell save lives by exposing incompetence, or did he cost lives by fueling the fire of the moral crusade? Drop a comment below. I want to see where you stand on the power of the media in wartime. And if you're realizing that the 1850s weren't that different from today, make sure you've liked this video and subscribed to Dark History Untold. We're about to see what happens when that public fury finally gets its wish. The British and French fleets were no longer just a deterrent. They were a delivery system for the public's rage. The destination was already chosen. The target was the heart of Russian naval power. The ships were being loaded. The soldiers were being fitted for their wool tunics. And the telegraph was waiting to tell the world exactly what happened when the first shot was fired. The era of the modern war had truly begun, and its first victim was going to be the truth of what it actually takes to win a siege. The road to Crimea was now open, paved with the good intentions of a public that had no idea what it was truly asking for. On September 14, 1854, the residents of the Crimean coast witnessed a sight that defied the imagination. Emerging from the morning haze was a forest of masts so dense it seemed to block out the horizon itself. This was the Allied Expeditionary Force, over 400 ships carrying 62,000 men, thousands of horses, and hundreds of heavy siege guns. It was the largest amphibious operation the world had ever seen, a massive iron and timber fist aimed directly at the throat of the Russian Empire. As the ships dropped anchor at Calamita Bay, the sheer scale of the operation masked a deep and dangerous rot within the Allied leadership. The men in charge were not just from different nations, they were from different centuries. Leading the British was Lord Raglan. At 65, Raglan was the living embodiment of the ghosts of Waterloo. He had served as the Duke of Wellington's right-hand man nearly 40 years earlier, losing his right arm to a French bullet during that legendary battle. Raglan was a man of impeccable manners and quiet bravery, but he was trapped in a time capsule. He had spent the decades following Napoleon's defeat behind a desk, managing the paperwork of an empire. The dark history of Raglan's command is found in his vocabulary. He had fought the French for so long that his brain refused to accept the new reality. During high-level strategy meetings, he would frequently gesture toward the Russian lines and refer to the enemy as the French. His aides would have to gently correct him, reminding him that the men in the blue coats sitting across the table were now his allies, and the men in the gray coats on the hills were the target. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue, it was a symptom of a military mindset that had stopped evolving in 1815. Across from him sat the French commander, Marshal Saint Arnaud. If Raglan was a relic of the past, Saint Arnaud was a desperate man of the present. He was a political soldier who had helped Napoleon III seize power, but by the time he reached the shores of Crimea, he was a walking corpse. He was dying of stomach cancer, his body so racked with agony that he had to be strapped into his saddle just to review his troops. He was fueled by laudanum and a frantic need to secure his legacy before the clock ran out. The contrast was staggering. Raglan was cautious, slow, and polite to a fault. Saint Arnaud was aggressive, impulsive, and burning with a feverish intensity. These two men, who could barely communicate and shared a deep, ancestral distrust, were now responsible for the lives of 60,000 soldiers in a land they didn't understand. The landing at Calamita Bay began in an atmosphere that felt more like a chaotic picnic than a military invasion. There was no Russian opposition on the beach. Tsar Nicholas's commanders had decided to let the Allies land, believing they could crush them more easily once they marched inland. This gave the world a front-row seat to the logistical nightmare of 19th-century warfare. British soldiers waded ashore in their heavy, scarlet wool tunics. Think about that for a moment. These uniforms were designed for the damp, cold climate of England or the ceremonial parades of London. Now, the men were wearing them under a blistering Crimean sun. Within hours, the wool was soaked with sweat and caked with salt. The men were burdened with heavy packs, stiff leather stocks around their necks that made it difficult to breathe, and rifles that felt like lead weights. While the French landed with a certain professional efficiency, bringing portable kitchens and organized medical tents, the British landing was a portrait of bureaucratic failure. Supplies were dumped in random heaps on the sand. Regiments wandered the beach looking for their tents, while other units sat on crates of ammunition they couldn't use because they had no food. But the most terrifying guest at this landing wasn't a Russian soldier, it was an invisible killer that had followed them from their staging camps in Bulgaria. Cholera. The disease had already decimated the ranks during the summer, but the strain of the landing and the lack of clean water caused it to flare up with renewed fury. Men who had stepped off the boats with dreams of glory were suddenly doubled over in the sand, their bodies turning blue as they were hollowed out by the infection. There was no organized ambulance corps. The sick were left where they fell or carried back to the ships by comrades who were already showing the first signs of the cramp. This is the reality of the modern war that the newspapers back home weren't showing. They showed the 400 ships and the glittering bayonets. They didn't show the veteran of Waterloo struggling to remember who he was fighting, or the French marshal clutching his stomach in a drug-induced haze, or the thousands of boys in red wool dying in the dirt before they had even seen a Russian uniform. Raglan and Saint Arnaud eventually agreed on a plan, though agreed is a generous term. They would march south toward the great fortress of Sevastopol. They moved in parallel columns, the French on the right, hugging the coast so they could stay under the protective umbrella of the fleet's guns, and the British on the left, exposed to the interior. As they began their march, the heat became an enemy as formidable as any Tsar. The lack of transport animals meant the men had to carry everything. Every mile took a toll. The scarlet line began to fray as men dropped out of the ranks, exhausted or dying. Yet, the music played. The regimental band struck up the British Grenadiers, and Partant pour la Syrie, the sound of the drums echoing across the dry, dusty plains. They were marching toward a small river called the Alma. They knew the Russians were waiting there. They knew they would have to fight for the high ground. But as Raglan looked through his telescope, perhaps he wasn't seeing the hills of Crimea. Perhaps he was seeing the ridge at Waterloo, looking for the phantom of the great Duke to tell him what to do next. Before we witness the first major bloodletting of this war at the Battle of the Alma, I want to ask you, if you were a soldier on that beach, watching your commanders struggle to even agree on what day it was, would you have kept your faith in the moral crusade? Or would you have realized that you were a pawn in a game played by men who were out of their depth? Drop a comment below, let's talk about the danger of putting the past in charge of the future. And if you're appreciating this deep dive into the hidden struggles of history, make sure you've liked this video. It helps us reach more people who want the truth. The ghosts of Waterloo were about to meet the reality of the industrial age. The Scarlet Line was moving. The Russian guns were being loaded. And the River Alma was about to turn red. On the morning of September 20, 1854, the Allied army stood on the northern bank of the Alma River, looking up at a wall of fire. This was the moment the diplomatic posturing ended and the mechanical reality of war began. The Russian commander, Prince Menshikov, had chosen his ground with a predator's eye. He occupied the Kurgan Hill, a massive, steep-sloped height that dominated the river crossing. At its center sat the Great Redoubt, an earthwork fortification packed with heavy artillery and thousands of infantrymen. From the heights, the Russians looked down with a sense of invincibility. They were dug in, protected by stone walls and deep trenches, while the British and French were forced to advance across a wide, flat valley with absolutely no cover. It was a shooting gallery. Menshikov was so confident in his position that he had invited local civilians from Sevastopol to bring picnics to the hills, as if they were watching a theater performance rather than a battle. But he didn't understand the nature of the men marching toward him. The British advance that afternoon was a display of what I call discipline colder than courage. In the movies, charges are usually depicted as a frantic, screaming rush. The reality at the Alma was far more haunting. The British battalions, the Guards, the Highlanders, the Light Division, moved in long, thin lines, 2 men deep. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They marched at a steady, rhythmic pace, their boots thudding against the dry grass in perfect time. As they reached the river, the Russian artillery opened a gap in the world. Solid iron balls plowed through the ranks, bouncing along the ground and shattering legs and torsos. When a man fell, the line didn't break. The soldiers on either side simply stepped over the body, closed the gap, and kept marching. There was no hesitation, no outward display of fear. It was a mechanical, terrifying progress. This wasn't the fiery passion of a revolutionary charge, it was the icy, ingrained obedience of men who had been drilled until their survival instincts were secondary to the sergeant's voice. They waded through the Alma, water up to their waists, holding their rifles high to keep the powder dry. On the southern bank, the real horror began. The Great Redoubt was spitting canister shot, hundreds of musket balls packed into a single shell that turned the hill into a vertical slaughterhouse. Think about the psychological weight of that moment. You are climbing a steep hill, exhausted, soaked from the river, and every few seconds, a wall of lead sweeps away the men to your left and right. You can hear the whistle of the balls and the wet thud as they hit flesh. And yet, you do not stop. You do not turn back. You keep your eyes on the man in front of you and you climb. Have you ever wondered what it takes to override the most basic human instinct of self-preservation? To follow an order that you know, with absolute certainty, will result in your death? The British soldiers weren't fighting for a queen or a country in that moment, they were fighting for the man next to them and the fear of being the one who broke the line. We all have orders in our lives, expectations from society, bosses, or tradition. But have you ever been asked to do something that felt like a march toward a great redoubt? How do you decide when to follow and when to question? The conflict here is between the human soul and the military machine. The British commanders were using these men like blocks of wood, throwing them at a fortified position with no clever tactics, just a blunt reliance on their inability to say no. Does this level of discipline deserve our respect, or should it be a warning about the danger of total obedience? Drop a comment below. I want to know your thoughts on blindly following orders. Is it the ultimate virtue of a soldier, or the ultimate failure of a human being? If these stories of the hidden cost of history resonate with you, make sure you've liked this video. Your engagement is the only reason we can keep digging into these dark history files. As the British reached the mouth of the redoubt, the discipline turned into a frenzied, desperate violence. There were no more orders, only the primal instinct to kill or be killed. They scrambled over the earthworks, bayonets fixed. The Russian gunners, who had been slaughtering them for an hour, were now within reach. It was a chaotic, bloody melee. Men used their rifles as clubs, they fought with knives, rocks, and bare hands. The air was thick with the smell of sulphurous smoke and the metallic tang of fresh blood. For a few minutes, the British actually held the redoubt. They had done the impossible, they had taken the high ground through sheer, bloody-minded persistence. But the victory was fleeting. A massive column of Russian infantry, fresh and outnumbering the battered British 3-1, counterattacked from the ridge above. The British were forced back down the slope they had just died to conquer. The battle could have ended there, a bloody failure, if not for the arrival of the Highland Brigade under Sir Colin Campbell and the Guards. As the Highlanders began their climb, Campbell gave them a chilling command: don't pull a trigger until you're within 20 yards. They moved up the hill like a slow, red tide. The Russian infantry, used to fighting in massive, dense columns, were baffled by the thin British lines. The British rifles, the new mini-rifles, had a range and accuracy the Russians couldn't match. When the Highlanders finally fired, the effect was like a scythe through wheat. The Russian columns didn't just break, they dissolved. By 4 in the afternoon, the heights were won. Menshikov and his picnicking civilians fled towards Sevastopol in a panicked rout. The Allies had won the first major battle of the war, but the cost was etched into the hillside. The Alma was no longer a river, it was a trench of the dead. Over 3,000 British and French soldiers lay on the slopes, their scarlet and blue uniforms stark against the brown earth. The Russian losses were even higher, nearly 6,000 men. As the sun began to set, Lord Raglan rode across the battlefield. He saw the piles of bodies around the great redoubt, the men he had ordered to march into a massacre. He reportedly looked at the carnage and said nothing, his face a mask of Waterloo-era stoicism. The road to Sevastopol was open. The Russian army was broken and retreating in chaos. If the Allies had marched that evening, or even the next morning, the war might have ended in a week. The fortress was undefended, the garrison was in shock, and the giant was reeling. But the discipline colder than courage that had won the battle now became a curse. Raglan, ever the cautious staff officer, refused to move. He insisted on treating the wounded and reorganizing his supplies. He chose the comfort of the routine over the risk of the pursuit. This hesitation is the dark secret of the Alma. The soldiers had done their part. They had marched through the fire. They had died in the river. They had given their commanders a golden bridge to victory. And the commanders, trapped in their own rigid bureaucracy and ancestral fears, simply stayed put. They stayed put long enough for a young Russian engineer named Totleben to reach Sevastopol. They stayed put long enough for the sick man to find his second wind. And they stayed put long enough for a one-week campaign to turn into a one-year nightmare. The blood of the Alma had been spilled for a victory that the generals were too afraid to take. The real siege was about to begin, and the men who survived the hill were about to find out that there are worse ways to die than a Russian bullet. While the Allied commanders sat in their tents outside the heights of the Alma, debating the logistics of a pursuit they were too cautious to undertake, a single man was riding towards Sevastopol with the weight of an empire on his shoulders. His name was Colonel Franz Eduard Totleben. He was not a glamorous aristocrat or a decorated cavalry hero. He was a career military engineer, a man of mathematics, dirt, and shovel work. When Totleben arrived at the fortress, he found a city in a state of terminal panic. The Russian army was a shattered remnant, retreating in disorder. More importantly, the city's landward defenses were practically non-existent. Sevastopol had been designed as a naval base, its massive stone batteries all faced the sea to repel a fleet. To the south, where the British and French were now regrouping, there was little more than a few crumbling walls and a handful of outdated trenches. If the Allies had marched immediately, the war would have been over in 48 hours. But the Allies didn't march. They hesitated for 5 critical days. In the world of Franz Totleben, 5 days was an eternity. Todleben understood a fundamental truth that the British and French elite had forgotten: you cannot defeat an enemy who is willing to bury himself in the earth. He looked at the hard Crimean soil and saw his greatest weapon. He didn't waste time trying to build grand stone fortresses that would take months to dry and years to finish. Instead, he mobilized the entire city. Sailors from the scuttled Black Sea Fleet, soldiers, and even civilians were handed shovels. He worked them in 24-hour shifts. Under his direction, they threw up massive earthwork bastions, the Malakoff and the Redan, structures made of compacted soil, sandbags, and gabions. These weren't elegant, but they were genius. Earthworks possessed a quality that stone did not: they could absorb an iron cannonball without shattering. A stone wall would crack and collapse into rubble under bombardment, but a 15-foot thick wall of dirt simply swallowed the shell. If a section was damaged, a crew could shovel it back into place overnight. By the time the Allies finally completed their slow, methodical march around the city to begin the siege from the south, the undefended city had vanished. In its place was a jagged line of formidable, mud-colored giants bristling with heavy naval guns stripped from the sunken Russian ships. This was the miracle of Todleben. The Allies had traded their momentum for a front-row seat to a fortress that hadn't existed when they won the Battle of the Alma. The Allies, still convinced of their technological superiority, decided that a massive, coordinated bombardment would solve the problem. On the morning of October 17, 1854, the earth shook. Over 100 heavy guns from the British and French siege lines, supported by the massive broadsides of the Allied fleet in the harbor, opened fire simultaneously. It was intended to be the final word in the argument. The sound was a continuous, physical assault on the senses, a rolling thunder that could be heard across the Black Sea. In London and Paris, the public waited for the telegraph to announce the fall of the city. For the gunners in the trenches, it felt like the end of the world. They watched as their shells hammered into the Russian bastions, throwing up plumes of dust and debris that obscured the sun. But as the smoke began to clear in the late afternoon, the horror of the situation dawned on the Allied commanders. The bombardment was a catastrophic failure. On the British right, the Russian gunners, many of them sailors who were used to the rapid-fire drills of a deckside battery, had returned fire with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. They hadn't just survived the shelling, they were winning the duel. They targeted the Allied ammunition magazines with pinpoint accuracy. At 1 p.m., a Russian shell hit a French magazine at the Mount Rodolphe battery. The explosion was so massive it sent a mushroom cloud of fire and smoke hundreds of feet into the air, instantly silencing dozens of French guns and killing scores of men. More importantly, Todleben's earthworks had done exactly what they were designed to do. While the Allied ships had hammered the stone seaforts to little effect, the landward siege guns found that their iron shot was simply disappearing into the Russian mud. The miracle wasn't just that Todleben had built the walls, it was that the walls were alive. Every time a gap appeared in the Malakoff or the Redan, Russian work gangs, hidden by the dust, would scramble into the breach with baskets of earth to repair the damage while the shells were still falling. By sunset, the Allied fleet was forced to withdraw, battered and bruised by the Russian coastal guns. The land batteries were exhausted, their barrels overheated and their ammunition dangerously low. The grand assault that was supposed to follow the bombardment was quietly cancelled. The fortress was still there. The guns were still firing. And the Russian giant, far from being crushed, was digging in deeper. This is the dark irony of the October bombardment. The British and French had spent weeks preparing for a civilized siege, following the rules of warfare laid down by generations of engineers. They expected the Russians to fold once the proper amount of pressure was applied. But they were facing a man who didn't care about the rules. Todleben had turned the siege into a war of attrition, a battle of shovels against shells. He had proven that in the industrial age, a determined defender with enough dirt and enough desperation could nullify the world's most advanced artillery. The Allies were no longer in a campaign of glory, they were trapped in a grinding, mechanical nightmare. As the fires of the bombardment died down, the temperature in the trenches began to drop. The first cold winds of autumn were blowing in from the steppes. The British soldiers, still in their rotted summer uniforms, looked at the massive earthworks of the Redan and realized that they weren't going home by Christmas. They had missed their window. The sick man had built a wall of mud and iron that would take a year to break, and the winter was coming for them all. Before we move into the desperate heroics of the Battle of Balaclava, I want to ask you, does history reward the proper way of doing things, or does it reward the person who is willing to innovate in the dirt? The Allies had the manuals, but Tottleben had the shovels. Drop a comment below. If you were Lord Raglan, seeing those earthworks grow day by day, would you have risked everything on a premature assault, or would you have waited for the guns, as he did? If you're enjoying this look into the engineering and the ego that defined the Crimean War, make sure you've liked the video. The stage was now set for the most famous blunder in military history. The guns were silent for now, but the cavalry was about to move. The valley was waiting. October 25, 1854, began with a chilling clarity. The morning mist over the valley of Balaclava peeled back to reveal a sight that made the British heart skip a beat. 25,000 Russian troops, a massive tide of grey-coated infantry and glinting steel, were pouring over the surrounding hills. Their objective was simple and devastating: seize the port of Balaclava, cut off the British supply lines, and leave the Allied army to starve in the trenches. The British were caught in a vulnerable position. Most of their strength was tied up 7 miles away at the siege of Sevastopol. What stood between the Russian giant and the vital supply base was a dangerously small force of cavalry and a single regiment of Scottish infantry, the 93rd Highlanders. As the Russian cavalry, 3,000 horsemen strong, began to crest the heights and look down into the valley, they saw a sight that should have been an invitation to a slaughter. Sir Colin Campbell, the veteran commander of the Highlanders, had no time to form a defensive square. He didn't have the numbers to create a deep formation. Instead, he did something that defied all military doctrine of the 19th century. He lined his 550 men up in a long, thin line, just 2 ranks deep. It was a scarlet thread of wool and grit stretched across the dirt. Standard practice dictated that infantry facing a cavalry charge must form a hollow square to present a wall of bayonets. A line was considered suicide. A single breakthrough would mean the entire formation would be ridden down and sabred from behind. But Campbell knew his men. He rode along the line, his eyes locking with theirs, and delivered the command that would echo through history. It wasn't a speech about glory, it was a brutal statement of reality. He looked at those 500 souls and said, "There is no retreat from here, men. You must die where you stand." The response from the ranks was not a cheer, but a grim, Scottish acknowledgement: "Aye, Sir Colin. If needs be, we'll do that." The Russian cavalry began their descent. To the observers on the heights, it looked like a massive grey wave about to crash over a tiny red breakwater. The horsemen accelerated, the thud of thousands of hooves shaking the ground. The Highlanders stood perfectly still. They didn't fire at 500 yards. They didn't fire at 400. They waited until the air was thick with the smell of horse sweat and the sound of jangling bridles. At 150 yards, the line erupted. A volley of mini-rifle fire tore into the front ranks of the Russian cavalry. Horses tumbled, riders were thrown, and the charge wavered. The Highlanders reloaded with a mechanical, terrifying speed. A second volley followed. The thin red line, as the newspapers would later call it, didn't budge an inch. The Russian commander, convinced that such a thin formation must be a trap or backed by hidden reserves, ordered his men to wheel away. The scarlet thread had held. But the danger was far from over. As the Russian cavalry retreated and reorganized, they moved deeper into the valley, where they suddenly found themselves face to face with the British Heavy Cavalry Brigade. If the Highlanders' stand was a display of icy discipline, what followed was a display of raw, chaotic fury. General James Scarlett, leading the Heavy Brigade, found himself at the bottom of a slope with 3,000 Russian horsemen looming above him. He didn't wait to be attacked. He didn't wait for a better position. He looked at his 300 men, the Scots Greys and the Inniskilling Dragoons, and ordered them to charge uphill. It was a tactical absurdity. You don't charge a force that outnumbers you 10 to 1 while galloping against the grain of a hill. But the British horsemen didn't hesitate. They slammed into the massive Russian column like a spear tip. What followed was not a clean military engagement, it was a brawl in a confined space. Because the Russians were so tightly packed and the British had penetrated so deep into their center, there was no room for maneuvering. It became a frantic, visceral struggle of man against man, blade against blade. The air was filled with the metallic clink-clink of sabers hitting each other and the guttural grunts of men exerting every ounce of strength. The British heavy cavalry used their long, straight swords to thrust, while the Russians slashed with their curved blades. It was a mess of rearing horses, splashing blood, and the high-pitched screams of animals caught in the crush. For 8 minutes, the valley floor was a whirlpool of violence. The British redcoats were swallowed up by the grey mass of the Russians, yet they refused to be digested. They hacked and stabbed their way through the center, creating a sense of panic within the Russian ranks. The Russians, despite their overwhelming numbers, couldn't understand how this tiny force hadn't been obliterated. They began to feel the untold terror of an enemy that simply wouldn't break. Finally, the Russian column began to heave and fracture. The rear ranks, seeing the chaos at the front and fearing they were being overwhelmed, turned and fled back toward the heights. The heavy brigade had done the impossible. They had broken a force 10 times their size in a head-on collision. As the dust settled, the British were exhausted, their horses blown, but they had secured the valley. They had defended the port. The thin red line and the heavy charge had provided a masterclass in what happens when the human spirit refuses to acknowledge the odds. This is the hidden high point of the Battle of Balaclava. We often focus on the tragedy that came next, but we forget that before the blunder, there was a moment of absolute, shining competence. Campbell's men were willing to die where they stood, and Scarlett's men were willing to charge into a wall of steel. But as Lord Raglan watched from the heights, his mind was already moving toward the next move on the chessboard. He saw the Russians retreating, and he saw an opportunity to recapture the guns they had taken earlier in the morning. He reached for his pen to write an order that was poorly phrased, delivered by an arrogant messenger, and received by a commander who couldn't see the target. Before we witness the most famous disaster in military history, I want to ask you, why do we remember the failure of the Light Brigade so much more clearly than the success of the Heavy Brigade or the Highlanders? Is it because we find tragedy more poetic than victory? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts on why the blunder overshadows the bravery in our history books. And if you're finding this deep dive into the grit and the glory of Crimea as meaningful as I do, make sure you've liked the video. The valley was quiet for a moment. But the light cavalry was already mounting their horses. The death trap was being set, not by the Russians, but by the very men in charge of the British Army. The most famous mile and a quarter in history was about to be ridden. To understand the charge of the Light Brigade, you have to understand that it was not a tragedy born of a single mistake. It was a perfect storm of ego, hatred, and a catastrophic failure of language. At the center of this storm were 3 men: Lord Raglan, the commander who couldn't write a clear sentence, Lord Lucan, the commander who couldn't see the battlefield, and Lord Cardigan, the commander who didn't care if he lived or died, as long as he followed the rules. Lord Raglan sat on the high Sapin heights, looking down into the valley as if it were a game of toy soldiers. He saw the Russians preparing to haul away captured British cannons from the causeway heights. To Raglan, the cannons were symbols of honor. To lose them was a disgrace. He dictated a hurried, vague order to his aide, Captain Lewis Nolan: Lord Lucan will advance the cavalry rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Nolan, a brilliant but arrogant officer who despised the amateur lords in charge, galloped down into the valley. He delivered the order to Lord Lucan. But Lucan was at the bottom of the hill. From his perspective, the causeway heights were a wall of earth that hid the captured cannons. He looked around and saw only one set of guns, a massive Russian battery at the far end of a 1.25 long valley, flanked on both sides by thousands of Russian infantry and even more artillery. "What guns, sir?" Lucan asked, confused. Nolan, instead of clarifying, threw his arm toward the end of the valley with a gesture of pure contempt. "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." It was the ultimate failure of communication. Nolan was pointing generally toward the hills, but Lucan saw only the death trap at the end of the valley. He rode over to his brother-in-law, Lord Cardigan. These two men hated each other so intensely they hadn't spoken in weeks. Cardigan looked at the order and saw the insanity of it. He knew that to charge down that valley was to commit suicide. But Cardigan was a man of a very specific, rigid breed. He was a martinet, a man for whom an order, no matter how stupid, was a sacred command. With a sociopathic level of detachment, Cardigan simply nodded. He didn't ask for a second opinion. He didn't protest the waste of life. He merely said, "Well, here goes the last of the Brutinels," and ordered his 670 men to mount. The 1.25 ride began at a trot. Cardigan sat at the very front, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the Russian battery a mile away. He forbade his men to break into a gallop too early, fearing it would look disorderly. He led his brigade into the mouth of hell with the same cold indifference he might show during a parade in London. Then the crossfire began. From the heights on the left and the heights on the right, the Russian artillery opened a rhythmic, devastating fire. This wasn't just cannonballs, it was canister shot. Imagine hundreds of lead balls, the size of marbles, turning the air into a wall of shredding metal. The clink of the lead hitting the helmets and the thud of it hitting the horses created a sickening percussion. Men were blown out of their saddles. Horses were disemboweled in mid-stride. And yet, the Light Brigade kept their formation. They closed the gaps. If a man fell, the rider to his left and right moved in to touch knees, maintaining the line. It was a display of discipline that borders on the unnatural. Captain Nolan, perhaps realizing the mistake at the last second, tried to ride across the front of the brigade to redirect them. A shell fragment hit him in the chest, his death scream echoing across the valley as his horse carried his corpse back through the ranks. As they reached the final 400 yards, the Russian guns at the end of the valley switched to direct fire. The smoke was so thick the riders couldn't see the sun. They were riding into a wall of gray sulfur. They reached the battery and actually rode through it, sabering the gunners in a frenzied, bloody moment of revenge. But they were only a few hundred survivors surrounded by an entire Russian army. Realizing the futility, Cardigan turned his horse around and rode back. He didn't look back to see how many of his men were following. He didn't stay to organize a retreat. He simply rode back at a walk, as coolly as he had arrived, while the remnants of his brigade were being hunted down and slaughtered behind him. When he reached the British lines, he reportedly complained that Captain Nolan had been disrespectful to him. 110 of his men were dead, over 100 were wounded, and hundreds of horses lay twitching in the dirt. Cardigan's response? He went to his private yacht, had a hot bath, and ate a gourmet dinner with a bottle of champagne. This is the dark history of leadership. We are often taught that the charge of the Light Brigade was a glorious sacrifice. But was it? Or was it the result of three aristocrats who were more concerned with their own pride and the proper way of doing things than the lives of the men they commanded? Raglan's vague writing killed more men than the Russian guns. We've all seen it in our own lives, leaders who are out of touch, who give orders from the heights without seeing the valley their people are actually in. The conflict here is between the brilliance of the soldiers and the staggering incompetence of the elite. These men did the impossible because they were told to, not because it made sense. At what point does loyalty become a death wish? And when does an incompetent leader lose the right to be followed? I want to hear from you in the comments. Is there such a thing as noble incompetence? Or should Raglan, Lucan, and Cardigan be remembered not as heroes, but as the architects of a crime? If you're tired of history being sanitized for the textbooks, make sure you've liked this video. It's the only way we can continue to tell the untold side of these stories. The valley was now littered with the Noble 600. The charge had lasted 20 minutes. It had achieved nothing. The captured British guns were still in Russian hands. The strategic situation hadn't changed by a single inch. But as the survivors straggled back, a new kind of war was beginning, one that would be fought not with sabers, but with the cold, hard data of a woman who was watching the casualty lists from across the sea. The ghosts of Waterloo had finally led the army to its doom. Now, it was time for the lady with the lamp to see if she could find a way to save what was left. While the survivors of the Light Brigade were still scrubbing the blood of the valley from their uniforms, a second, more silent enemy was preparing to finish what the Russian guns had started. If the first half of the Crimean War was defined by the incompetence of the generals, the second half was defined by the collapse of the very idea of civilization. By November 1854, the Allied army was a hollow shell. They were camped on the heights above Sevastopol, exposed to the elements, their summer uniforms rotted to rags. Then, on November 14, the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple. A hurricane of unparalleled ferocity tore across the Black Sea. It was a weather event of biblical proportions, leveling tents, overturning wagons, and freezing the marrow of men already weakened by hunger. But the real tragedy was at sea. In the harbor of Balaclava, the storm claimed 30 ships. Among them was the Prince, a massive steam transport carrying the entire winter supply for the British Army. In a single afternoon, 40,000 pairs of boots, tons of winter clothing, and an entire mountain of medical supplies sank to the bottom of the ocean. The British Army was now stranded in a sub-zero wasteland with nothing but thin wool and hope to protect them. Starvation became a daily ritual. The horses died first, their carcasses left in the mud because no one had the strength to bury them. Then the men began to fade. They weren't dying from Russian lead, they were dying from scurvy, dysentery, and a profound, bone-deep cold. When a soldier's body finally quit, he was shipped across the Black Sea to a place that had become synonymous with the end of the world, the Scutari Hospital in Constantinople. The dark history of Scutari is a descent into a nightmare. It was a converted Turkish barracks, vast and cold, built directly over a massive, overflowing cesspool. When the wounded arrived, they were laid out on the bare, filth-encrusted floors. There were no linens, no clean water, and no bandages. The air was so thick with the smell of rot and human waste that the doctors often worked with handkerchiefs tied over their faces. One doctor for every 250 patients. The mortality rate was 40%. If you entered Scutari, you were more likely to leave in a pine box than on your own 2 feet. This was the hell that Florence Nightingale stepped into in November 1854. We are often taught the sanitized version of Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, a gentle, angelic figure hovering over the dying with a soft word and a candle. But the real Florence Nightingale was something much more formidable. She was a data-driven warrior. She was a cold, methodical administrator who understood that compassion without organization was just a slower way to die. Nightingale didn't just bring medicine, she brought a revolution in mathematics. She was a pioneer of the coxcomb or polar area diagram, a way of visualizing data that proved exactly why the men were dying. Her data revealed a terrifying truth that the military elite wanted to bury: the soldiers weren't dying of their wounds. They were being murdered by the hospital itself. Her charts showed that even during the height of the battles, more men were dying from preventable zymotic diseases, cholera, typhus, and dysentery, than from Russian bayonets. She used her statistics like a scalpel, cutting through the bureaucratic lies of the British War Office. She fought the medical staff with a ferocity that bordered on the obsessive. She was a master of logistics. When the army refused to provide supplies, she used her own funds and her connections to the press back in London to shame them into action. She realized that the moral crusade was being lost in the filth of the wards. She didn't just scrub the floors, she re-engineered the entire concept of a hospital. Nightingale instituted strict sanitation protocols. She forced the army to repair the sewers beneath the barracks. She demanded clean laundry and edible food. She treated the hospital like a factory of recovery, where data dictated the workflow. She was the one who realized that if you don't track the outcomes, you can't fix the failures. Her lamp wasn't just for comfort, it was for the midnight hours she spent over her spreadsheets, calculating the cost of incompetence in human lives. By the time she was finished, the mortality rate at Scutari dropped from 40% to an incredible 2%. It was one of the greatest victories of the war, achieved not by a cavalry charge, but by a woman with a ledger and a relentless will. However, the tension between the front lines and the hospitals remained a jagged wound. While Nightingale was fixing Scutari, the men in the trenches outside Sevastopol were still eating their own horses to stay alive. The disconnect between the high command and the reality of the soldier was absolute. The British public, reading William Howard Russell's reports of the Prince sinking and the starvation that followed, began to realize that their moral crusade was being led by ghosts who couldn't even manage a shipment of boots. This is the untold tragedy of the winter of 1854. The bravery of the men was being liquidated by a system that was fundamentally broken. We see a mirror of this today, when we value the appearance of leadership over the reality of results. I want to pause here and ask you, do you think we still suffer from the Scutari syndrome in our modern world? Do we value the heroic leader on a horse more than the data-driven expert in the backroom who actually knows how to save lives? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts on Florence Nightingale as a scientist rather than a saint. And if you're finding that the real heroes of history are often the ones holding the pens and the ledgers, make sure you've liked this video. It keeps us moving forward. The winter was finally beginning to break, but the damage was done. An entire generation of the British professional army had been erased, not by the Tsar, but by the wind, the mud, and the ego of men who refused to believe that the world had changed. The spring of 1855 was coming, and with it, a new kind of commander, one who didn't care about the ghosts of Waterloo. The final act of the siege was about to begin, and it wouldn't be won by a gentleman's agreement. It would be won by the raw, industrial power of the French and the final, desperate collapse of the Russian giant. The Malakoff was waiting. By the spring of 1855, the air in the Crimea had changed. It was no longer thick with the stagnant stench of the winter hospitals, but with the heavy, metallic scent of industrial preparation. The ghosts of Waterloo were fading. Lord Raglan, worn down by the stress of a campaign he never understood, died in June, his heart reportedly broken by the failure of his latest assault. But even more significant was the death that occurred months earlier in St. Petersburg. Tsar Nicholas I, the man whose ego had sparked the conflagration, was dead. He had died of pneumonia, but those close to him said he had simply lost the will to live as he watched his giant stumble and bleed. With Nicholas gone, the rigid, divine certainty of the Russian cause began to fracture. His successor, Alexander II, inherited a bankrupt treasury and an army that was running out of more than just food, it was running out of hope. On the Allied side, the rise of General Amable Pelissier changed the tempo of the war. Pelissier was not a man of manners. He was a blunt, aggressive commander who had spent his career in the brutal wars of North Africa. He didn't care about the proper way to conduct a siege, and he certainly didn't care about the casualty lists. He had one singular obsession, the Malakoff. The Malakoff was the key to everything. It was a massive, stone-and-earth tower that sat on the highest point of the Russian defenses. Tautleben had turned it into a masterpiece of engineering, a labyrinth of blind corners, hidden gun nests, and subterranean galleries. Pelissier knew that if the Malakoff fell, Sevastopol would become a bowl of fire. The French began a methodical, terrifying approach, digging their trenches closer and closer, sometimes within 30 yards of the Russian barrels. The final assault was scheduled for September 8, 1855. Unlike the previous, failed attempts that had been telegraphed by long bombardments, Policier ordered a sudden, overwhelming surge. At exactly noon, as the Russian garrison was changing its guard and sitting down to eat, the French sprang. The Zouaves, the elite, North African hardened troops of the French army, led the way. They didn't march in lines. They scrambled. They climbed the steep earthworks with a feral intensity, using their bayonets as climbing hooks. Within minutes, the summit of the Malakoff was a vortex of hand-to-hand combat. It was a fight occurring in a space no larger than a few houses, where men fought with rocks, ramrods, and teeth. The Russians, realizing the anchor of their entire defense was slipping, launched counterattack after counterattack. But Policier did something Raglan never could: he fed his reserves into the fire immediately. He didn't wait to see if the first wave held, he made sure the second and third waves were already there to reinforce the breakthrough. By the late afternoon, the French flag flew over the Malakoff. While the French were securing the heights, the British were tasked with a simultaneous assault on the Redan. It was a mirror of their previous failures. They were forced to advance across a wide, open space into a concentrated storm of canister shot. The coordination was poor, the ladders were too short, and the leadership was hesitant. While the Malakoff fell to French grit, the Redan became another British slaughterhouse. But in the grand logic of the siege, the British failure didn't matter. The Malakoff was won, and with it, the war was over. As the sun set on September 8, the Russian commander, Prince Gorchakov, looked up at the French flag on the heights and knew the end had arrived. He couldn't retake the tower, and he couldn't stay in the city while French guns looked down his throat. He gave the order for a total, scorched-earth retreat. What followed was one of the most haunting spectacles in military history. The Russians didn't just leave, they attempted to delete Sevastopol from the map. As tens of thousands of Russian soldiers retreated across a massive, swaying bridge of boats toward the north side of the harbor, the city behind them began to explode. The Russians had spent days pre-planting massive demolition charges in their ammunition magazines, their stone forts, and their public buildings. One by one, the icons of Russian naval power were detonated. The sound was a continuous, earth-shaking roar that could be felt 10 miles away. The great stone batteries that had defied the Allied fleet for a year were turned into piles of jagged rubble in seconds. Fires broke out across the city, fueled by the vast stores of coal and timber. The remaining ships of the Black Sea Fleet, those that hadn't already been scuttled, were set on fire or blown up by their own crews. The harbor was a landscape of burning masts and sinking hulls. It was a final, chaotic act of defiance. If the Tsar couldn't have Sevastopol, no one would. The Allies watched from the trenches in a state of stunned silence. They had spent a year dying for this city, and now they were watching it vanish in a pillar of smoke and fire. When the first Allied patrols entered the streets the next morning, they found a ghost town. There were no civilians left, only the wounded who were too broken to move and the charred remains of a once proud imperial port. The giant had finally fallen, but it hadn't been a clean victory. It was a messy, industrial gutting of a city. The fall of the Malakoff was the moment the 19th century realized that modern warfare didn't end with a surrender and a parade. It ended with ruins and ash. Think about the psychological toll on those soldiers. You spend a year in the mud, you lose your friends to cholera, you watch your cavalry die in a valley, all to capture a city that is destroyed by the time you reach it. Was it worth it? Or was the victory just a way for the politicians to justify the mountain of bodies they had created? I want to hear from you in the comments. When an army destroys its own city rather than letting it be captured, is that an act of ultimate heroism or ultimate spite? And as we move into our final chapter, how do we weigh the cost of this victory against the absolute waste of the conflict? The guns were finally falling silent in the Crimea, but the ripples of this explosion were moving toward a treaty that would settle nothing. The dark history of the Crimea was almost complete, but the lessons were about to be ignored for another 60 years. The smoke over the ruins of Sevastopol finally cleared in 1856, not because of a grand ideological shift, but because the treasuries were empty and the graveyards were full. The Treaty of Paris, signed in March of that year, was the ultimate anticlimax. After 3 years of global tension and a year of agonizing siege, the map of Europe looked almost exactly as it had before the first shot was fired. Russia was forced to demilitarize the Black Sea, and the Ottoman Empire's borders were guaranteed by the Western powers. On paper, it was a victory for the moral crusade. In reality, it was a pause button. The fundamental tensions, the Eastern question, and the slow decay of the Sultan's power, remained unresolved. Within 15 years, Russia would simply tear up the treaty and rebuild its fleet. The dark history of the Crimean War is not found in the borders it redrew, but in the transition it signaled. This was the birth of the industrial age of slaughter. It was the moment the world moved from the romanticized era of the Napoleonic hero to the cold, mechanical era of the casualty statistic. We saw the first use of the telegraph to manipulate public opinion, the first tactical use of railways to feed the front, and the first time that rifle technology made traditional courage obsolete. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The Crimean War was a haunting preview of the 20th century. The trenches, the mud, the logistical failures, and the disconnect between the elite commanders and the dying soldiers would all reappear, amplified 1,000 times over, in 1914. The world was given a clear warning in the Crimea: modern war is a hungry machine that cares nothing for honor or intent. It only cares about output. We often talk about the 750,000 men who died in this conflict. If you laid their bodies end to end, they would stretch from London to the Black Sea. They died for a set of church keys, for the ego of a pretender in Paris, and for a Tsar's religious obsession. They died for a status quo peace that lasted less than 2 decades. When we look back at dark history untold, we don't look for the glory. We look for the cost. We look for the moments where the vanity of the few outweighed the lives of the many. The Crimean War was the ultimate proof that an empire's hubris is always paid for in the blood of the rank and file. I want to thank you for walking through this valley with me. If there is one lesson to take away from the Crimea, it's that we must be wary of leaders who look backward to find their glory, for they are the ones most likely to lead us into a grave. Was the Crimean War the most pointless conflict in history? Or was it a necessary check on a growing giant? I want to read your final thoughts in the comments. If you want to see how these lessons were ignored during the American Civil War or the Great War, click the video on your screen right now. And remember, the truth is rarely found in the victory parade. It's found in the dirt. This is Dark History Untold. Keep digging.